Hi. It's Friday, May 30th, 2025. I'm Larissa, and I decided I'm going to revisit reading out loud. Yeah. So here we are, back out in my yard, and I got Brody out here too. So he's going to be a pain in the butt, I'm sure. Hey, mister, you going to come up here? Come here. Come on. Hi. Yeah, how are you? How are you, sir? Oh my goodness, I tried to take him for a walk, and he wasn't having it. He's like, no, wild Brodies do not wear leashes. Oh my goodness. He doesn't like wearing a leash. It insults him. He's totally insulted by it. So I brought him back up to the house because I'm like, I can't walk with you like that. You're pulling on my arm, and I can't handle that. No. So I came back up to the house and I got my stick. I walked with my stick instead. That's what I did. So anyway, this is a John Steinbeck novel that I've never read before. And I'm going to read it out loud. And so it's going to be a total cold read because, like I said, I've never read this one. This is one of his very first novels. It was before To a God Unknown, which is my favorite book, not just my favorite Steinbeck novel, but my favorite book, To a God Unknown. So this is called The Pastures of Heaven. Yeah. The introduction to this book is super long. Super, super long. I'll read it, though. We'll do it from start to beginning. Introduction 1. The Pastures of Heaven by John Steinbeck. When The Pastures of Heaven was first published in the autumn of 1932, almost no one knew his name. John Steinbeck was not then the established writer he was to become later in the decade with the appearance of The Grapes of Wrath, and he was a long way from the celebrity status he was to enjoy with the award of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. In the early 1930s, he was a struggling writer, committed to a literary life, but still searching for a subject and a style. He found the first in the area he knew best, the farm country near his home in Salinas, California, and the simple people who settled there. This was the subject that was to inform the best of his work and to underlie his reputation as a writer of intellectual substance and social significance. In the writing of a series of stories about this area, he refined his fictional prose and a new method of organization, and he was well on the way to developing the consummate craft of his greatest work. John Ernst Steinbeck was born on February 27, 1902, in Salinas, California. His father's family, Rosenbecks, had come from Germany in the 19th century, settling briefly in Jerusalem before moving to Florida and then California, simplifying their name on the journey. The father, whose name was the same as his son's, worked at several occupations, milling flour and serving as treasurer of Monterey County. Steinbeck's mother, Olive Hamilton, came from an Irish family that had settled on a ranch near Monterey before the Civil War, and she had been a schoolteacher prior to her marriage. John and Olive established a home in the Salinas Valley between the Gabilan Mountains to the east and the Santa Lucia Range to the west. This was the area of John Steinbeck's youth and the terrain he was to capture in the best of his early work, especially in Of Mice and Men, The Red Pony, and his masterpiece, The Grapes of Wrath. But there was little in his early life to suggest the status he was later to attain. He was not an outstanding student in Salinas High School, from which he graduated in 1919, but he did have strong personal interests in science and classical literature. His experiences in an Episcopal Sunday school gave him a good background in Scripture, one he was to use in his fiction the rest of his life. At Stanford University, his record was less than exemplary. He attended sporadically from 1920 to 1925, taking courses in zoology and the classics and devoting himself to his training in creative writing, the only area in which he excelled. As Jackson Benson has pointed out, Steinbeck is unique in his generation for having studied the craft of writing fiction at a university. But some semesters he dropped out of school and worked as a common laborer, learning the ways of ranch hands and migrant workers, and later returned to Stanford for a semester or two. He left the university without graduating. He made an unsuccessful attempt to establish himself as a writer in New York City, but he ended up pushing wheelbarrows filled with concrete for the foundation of the Madison Square Garden. He returned to California, broke but determined to pursue a literary career. His first book, Cup of Gold, was an adventure tale about a pirate inspired in part by the success of Raphael Sabatini's Captain Blood, published in 1922, and made into a popular movie in 1925. Steinbeck had attempted to combine the tradition of the buccaneering romance with the Grail legend, but this first novel attracted scant attention. He worked at his next major project for 5 years, a novel now titled To a God Unknown. But this endeavor to meld Arthurian legend into tale about a California farmer's struggle against the elements was temporarily abandoned. It was set aside early in 1931 so that he could begin work on a volume of short stories, prompted by Elizabeth Ingalls' comment that she was going to write a volume of interconnected tales similar to what Sherwood Anderson had done in Winesburg, Ohio in 1919. She had grown up in a valley to the west of Salinas called Corral de Tierra, the Fence of Earth, and had the idea of doing a series of stories about the development of a young girl's interacting with the strange families of this confined environment. Steinbeck was inspired, for here was a subject closer to home than anything he had thus far attempted, and he quickly adapted Beth Ingalls' idea into the project that was to become the Pastures of Heaven. His idea for the new book was to remain largely constant throughout its development, although he changed several details and ultimately deleted a few of the original stories. In the spring of 1931, he wrote to his friend Ted Miller to say that he was at work on the Pastures of Heaven. Quote, "Now this is a series of related stories, each one dealing with a family in the Pastures." As the manuscripts indicate, his initial idea was to begin with a description of the valley, then move on to stories depicting roughly 10 families, then to introduce the Monroes, the key family that would influence the lives of the others in the concluding group of stories. As his work progressed on the first draft, however, he seems to have felt that the separate stories lacked unity, and he decided to introduce the Monroe family at the beginning, immediately after his description of the valley, thus unifying all of the following stories by the interventions of the Monroes. By May 8th, he was far enough along to write his new literary agent, Mavis McIntosh, explaining the basic plan for the volume. Quote, "The present work interests me and perhaps falls in the aspects theme you mention. There is, about 12 miles from Monterey, a valley in the hills called Corral de Tierra. Because I'm using its people, I have named it Las Pastures de Cielo. The valley was for years known as the Happy Valley because of the unique harmony which existed among its 20 families. About 10 years ago, a new family moved in one of the ranches. They were ordinary people, ill-educated but honest as any and as kindly as any. In fact, their whole history I cannot find that they have committed a really malicious act, nor an act which was not dictated by honorable expediency or out-and-out altruism. But the Morans there was a flavor of evil. Everyone they came in contact with was injured. Every place they went, dissension sprang up. There have been 2 murders, a suicide, many quarrels, and a great deal of unhappiness in the Pastures of Heaven. And all of these things can be traced directly to the influence of the Morans. So much is true." As he developed the group of stories, he took the central idea beyond what Beth Ingalls had originally suggested, making the material his own. In creating the schoolteacher named Molly Morgan, he drew on the experiences of his mother in the early years of her career. For the senior Whiteside, he utilized his father's interest in classical literature. He took a story about a pair of sisters who become reluctant prostitutes from another book he was planning and merged it into the structure of his new volume. By autumn 1931, he had finished the composition of the stories, and his wife, Carol, finished typing them sometime in early December. He immediately sent the manuscript to his agent, as he wrote to Ted Miller. Quote, "The Pastures of Heaven I sent off last Saturday. It should be there by the time you receive this. If the reader will take them for what they are and will not be governed by what a short story should be, for they are not short stories at all, but tiny novels, then they should be charming. But if they are judged by the formal short story, they are lost before they even start. I'm extremely anxious to hear the judgment, because of anything I've ever tried, I'm fondest of these and more closely tied to them. There is no grand writing nor any grand theme, but I love the stories very much. The initial reaction from Mavis McIntosh was negative, but she agreed to forward the collection to a publisher for a reading. The response was immediate and positive. The manuscript had been sent to Robert O. Ballou, an editor at Cape and Smith, and he accepted it for publication within 3 days. Steinbeck received the news on his 30th birthday, February 27, 1932, and it was the most encouraging development of his young career. But the euphoria was not to last. In March, he learned that Jonathan Cape had gone bankrupt, and his book was not to be published after all. Then, in a fortuitous development, Robert Ballou, set adrift by the failure of the firm, landed a position at Brewer, Warren, and Putnam, and he brought the Pastures of Heaven with him. By May, production on the bedeviled volume had resumed under the new imprint, and it appeared in October to very little fanfare, partly because the firm lacked the funds to market it aggressively. Indeed, shortly after publication of Steinbeck's book, the publisher also declared bankruptcy, and Steinbeck made very little money on the project. The depression, later to figure so importantly in his fiction, had hit him personally. In the final twist on the matter, 2 years later, Pascal Covici, head of publishing firm of Covici Fried in Chicago, read the stories enthusiastically and decided to buy up the contract and the existing backlog of books and issue the title again under his own imprint, which he did in the fall of 1935. The Pastures of Heaven was thus given a second life. However, the curious and convoluted history of the volume's publication is not as important as the role that the book played in Steinbeck's growth as a writer, for it was during the composition of these stories that he found the subject and the mode of artistic expression that were to generate the most important work of his life. For the publication of the volume was encouraging for Steinbeck. If the publication of the volume was encouraging for Steinbeck, the reviews were less so. For many critics did not understand the genre and faulted a collection of interrelated stories for not being a novel. The reactions to The Pastures of Heaven varied, but in general, they tended to praise Steinbeck's style, to puzzle about his genre, and to marvel at the variety of his characters and scope of his portrait of his fictional valley. Margaret Cheney Dawson, writing at length in the New York Herald Tribune books, October 23, 1932, remarked on the, quote, author's charming serenity of style, and concluded that, quote, there is a clarity of good humor and delicacy in Mr. Steinbeck's writing that makes the book fine reading. Describing the form of the volume, she observed that each of the chapters presents an individual or group enacting some small drama against the backdrop of Heaven's pastures. Short stories, they are really. The review in the Chicago Daily Tribune, November 19, 1932, concluded that, quote, the novel is well plotted, though perhaps the conclusion is of somewhat obvious type. The characters are as vitally real as your next-door neighbor, and the style and presentation of the novel are restrained, compassionate, as well as compelling. Anita Moffett wrote more extensively in the New York Times book review for November 20th, 1932, praising the prose of the volume. Steinbeck, quote, writes with deep feeling for the tragedy implicit in each situation, yet undeceived by the self-delusion or self-dramatization of the persons involved. Racy, realistically direct, and caustically humorous, his writing is noteworthy for originality of phrase and image and strongly poetic feeling. The commentator for the Saturday Review of Literature, November 26, 1932, observed that the quote, book is a collection of short stories unrelated except for the unity of place and the occasional appearance of one or another character in an episode in which he is not primarily featured. The comment that missed entirely the substantial thematic unity that Steinbeck had given his volume. A brief comment in The Nation on December 7, 1932, called the book a series of connected sketches that are obsessed with abnormal character types. Praising Steinbeck's style, the reviewer predicted that, quote, his future work should lead to his recognition as an excellent psychological analyst. Revealing the preoccupation of the age, he added that if Steinbeck, quote, could add social insight to his present equipment, he would be a first-rate novelist. Cyril Abels, in The Bookman for December of 1932, compared Pastures to Hilton's Ill Wind as another series of linked stories and suggested that in these tales, civilization shows a pathetic gray against the delightful green of nature, and even the Garden of Hesperides brings disillusion. A brief notice in the Book List, December 1932, observed that sensitivity, a very human pity, and humor preserved the book from an unwholesome impression that the themes of horror and abnormality might have conveyed in less skillful writing. Helen McAfee praised Steinbeck's characterization of his description of the valley and remarked that, quote, the author has a sense of motivation with psychological insight and understanding. The odd and queer people are naturally so. The normal people are normally so. The whole story is plausible and seemingly historical in its descriptions of places and events. But to come to terms with the adequacy of these early reviews and to attempt to understand the literary contributions, the context of The Pastures of Heaven, it is important to place the book in the context of two important literary traditions that converge in these stories: American literacy, naturalism, and the genre of the short story cycle, both of which had been gaining in importance in American fiction since the 1890s. Growing out of the hard edge of realism in the last decade of the 19th century, naturalism had become the dominant literary movement in American fiction by the turn of the century, manifesting its influence in the Bowery tales of Stephen Crane, the fight for survival in the work of Jack London, the grim struggle of simple characters against a world they cannot control in Frank Norris's fiction, and the complex inner drives that impel disaster in the novels of Theodore Dreiser. At the ideological heart of this literary tendency is pessimistic determinism, the notion that the causative factors in human tragedy lie beyond the powers of the individual. The influence of Darwin led to biological determinism and to atavistic scenes in which characters revert to primitive states of animalistic behavior. The influence of Karl Marx, coupled with problems emanating from the urbanization of America and the economic problems at the end of the 19th century, engendered the portrayal of socioeconomic forces that overwhelm individual lives. These themes came to replace, for a time, the ethical dilemma so prevalent in realism, in which characters struggle, as does Huck Finn, to make morally difficult decisions. Internal struggle is not significant in the context of external determinism, which overwhelms individual prerogatives. Beginning with The Pastures of Heaven, these concepts came to play an important role in the fiction of John Steinbeck. These themes led the naturalist to focus on the lives of the lower-class characters struggling for survival in an alien and often hostile society, one insensitive to their personal needs for fulfillment or self-expression. Often these characters are in some way grotesque, retarded, or misshapen victims of genetic accident, or people obsessed by greed, sexual craving, or compulsive plan for success that ultimately destroys them. Since the characters themselves are incapable of explaining the complex casual history of the events that sweep them along, the personalized narrative methods of realism in which simple characters tell their own stories is replaced with a dominant, omniscient narrator who can relate deterministic factors far beyond the knowledge of the characters affected by them. Since the underlying assumption of naturalism is that reality is not only comprehensible but stable and available for detailed scientific analysis, the tendency for symbolism, for dominant images that embody determining forces, for example, the variety of gold symbols that pervade Norris's McTeague, the plots of naturalism tend to depict the downward spiral of impending tragedy, and there is normally very little suspense about the final outcome of events. No one emerges triumphant in a naturalistic novel, since simple survival constitutes a moral victory. The style of naturalism lacks the grace of realism, and artistic subtlety and skillful turn of phrase give way to narrative exposition and the rational explanation of the implications of depicted events. John Steinbeck was not a dedicated student of American naturalism, and his fiction does not exhibit an uncompromised utilization of these tendencies, yet in theme and method his work has greater affinity to naturalism than to any other tradition in American literature. As his letters indicate, he was familiar with the work of Sherwood Anderson, whose Winesburg, Ohio is perhaps the greatest influence on the Pastures of Heaven. As a college student and aspiring writer in the 1920s, Steinbeck was aware of the growing popularity of such naturalistic writers as Erskine, Caldwell, James T. Farrell, and Edith Summers Kelly, as well as the older generations of naturalists Crane, Dreiser, Norris, and Jack London. The Pastures of Heaven is certainly a compendium of naturalistic tendencies, dominated by an omniscient character who establishes characters through expository comments rather than dramatic revelation. There are no deep mysteries within Steinbeck's characters that are beyond the reach of the narrative intelligence, no background influences that the narrator cannot explain, no events to come that are impossible to predict. Omniscience is a powerful tool in the telling of the story, but it obscures the subtleties of the human personality, subordinates organic development, and tends toward the depiction of static characters who emerge predictably as the victims of circumstances beyond their control. In the stories in Pasture, Steinbeck reveals as well the naturalistic tendency for grotesque characters. Alice Wicks and Manfred Monroe suffer from retardation. Myrtle and John battle from epilepsy and a form of insanity. Helen van Deventer from neurosis and Hilda van Deventer from schizophrenia. Tuarlicito, perhaps the most interesting of these personalities, is depicted as a retarded savant, severely restricted in the standard forms of learning, but gifted in the artistic recreation of the nature around him. Other characters suffer from obsessions that impel disaster or humiliation. Shark Wicks, for example, has a compulsive need to appear to be wealthy and shrewd investor of his mythical fortune. And John Whiteside is driven to create an estate and a dynasty to inhabit it throughout the coming generations, even though every ensuing development thwarts his deepest desires. As Richard Astro has pointed out, the underlying tragedy is that although this rich valley presents the promise of a fulfilling life, the characters within it are either so restricted or so driven by self-deception and obsession that they do not make the most of their abundant opportunities. In narrative method, style, characterization, and theme, The Pastures of Heaven owes much to the traditional norms of American naturalism. In form, however, its organizational principles derive from another source altogether, from a popular but not widely understood genre customarily called the short story cycle, a collection of interrelated stories. Distinct in many ways from the more celebrated novel, a cycle consists of stories that are independent fictional units, with a conflict, a resolution, and a sense of closure in each narrative. These stories are often published individually in magazines prior to being collected as a group, but placed in context with the other stories, each tale is enriched by the presence of the others. Often the stories are linked by a continuing central character, as they are in Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. Sometimes the unifying feature is the setting for the stories, as it is in Hamlin Garland's Main Traveled Roads or Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Firs. Sometimes the unifying element is the narrative voice of the stories, as in Charles Chestnut's The Conjured Tales or Joel Chandler Harris's Stories of Uncle Remus. And sometimes the stories are tied together thematically, with ideas reinforced or presented in counterpoint to the central motifs of the other works. The short story cycle is an older form than the novel, having its origins in such works as Boccaccio's The Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, works published centuries before the inception of the novel in English literature in the 18th century. In American literature, the story cycle came into prominence in the late 19th century when the demand for short works of fiction was at its highest point. In the late decades of the century, such works as Mary Wilkins Freeman's Six Trees, Stephen Crane's Stories of Williamville, and Charles Chestnut's The Conjure Tales gave expression to the form. In the early decades of the 20th century, the genre emerged as one of the most important forms of literature, and a brief list of important works would include such masterpieces as William Faulkner's Go Down Moses, Eudora Welty's The Golden Apples, and Jean Toomer's Cain, and scores of others. Oh, I love Faulkner. The artistic challenge of the short story cycle is always unity, some means of relating one story to another, making the whole greater than the sum of its parts. In The Pastures of Heaven, Steinbeck followed a tradition established much earlier by Garland, Crane, and Anderson of developing essential naturalistic themes within the form of interrelated stories. Garland has succeeded in main traveled roads by having each story advance the central ideas of democratic populism, placing in a sympathetic and humane light worthy characters pitted against external forces that overwhelm them. Crane used continuing characters in his tales of Sullivan County and Williamville, and the growth of development of these characters from story to story enriched the characterizations. Anderson blended several unifying devices in Winesburg, a stable location, rich with local personalities and historical conflicts, a continuing protagonist, George Willard, who confronts adult realities and matures through the sequence of stories, and unifying themes that bind one story to the other. Steinbeck was to follow in his tradition in his work on The Pastures of Heaven. One of the unifying elements he gave his book was the handling of time, with all the principal stories occurring in the general period of 1928 to 29. Within that temporal scheme, each succeeding story concludes somewhat later than the preceding one, so that there is a sense of historical progression to the flow of stories despite the flashbacks that sometimes open the narratives. The volume derives coherence as well from its structural organization, with the framing device of a prologue and an epilogue that provides a thematic envelope for 10 internal stories, each devoted to a family within a fictional valley. As Steinbeck explained in a letter to his agent, quote, "I'm using the following method. The manuscript is made up of stories, each one complete in itself, having its rise, climax, and ending. Each story deals with a family or an individual. They are tied together only by the common locality and the contact with the Morans." Although he was to change the name of the unifying family from Moran to Monroe, he conformed to this general plan throughout the writing of the manuscript. The opening prologue establishes the central unifying location for all of the stories, Las Pastures del Cielo, the pastures of heaven, at the same time suggesting many of the central ideas that are developed later in the stories. The central device of an omniscient narrator who not only relates events and dialogue, but comments on the action, often ironically continues throughout the collection, creating unity of tone and perspective. The motif of religion, beginning with the building of the Carmelo Mission in 1776, serves as a frequent point of reference, always with the suggestion that spirituality is in none of its forms provides much solace for the people of the valley. As Joseph Fontenrose points out in Steinbeck's Unhappy Valley, a study of the pastures of heaven, no religion is efficacious. Quote, "The Whitesides failed to establish a family dynasty in the new land. The religions of Maltby and Banks, the foundations of their lives, were shattered by Burt Munro's suggestions of evil. Junius believed something monstrous about himself and had to leave Eden. There were no gnomes and elves for Tullercito to find. Alice Wicks was not a special gift from heaven, though Helen Van Deventer, Molly Morgan, and Pat Humbert clung to or lapsed back into the old religion. It gave them no satisfaction." On the secular level, the Spanish corporal who discovers the valley has a dream of someday having a comfortable house beside a stream, an idea that develops into the repeated concern for the family home, the central issue in the concluding story of John Whiteside, and his dreams of a dynasty in the valley. At the core of the Spanish enslavement of the indigenous population to work on the mission is the idea of civilization in conflict with a more basic human nature, a motif that reoccurs in nearly every story. Finally, the prologue concludes with the tragic death of the Spanish corporal, suggesting not only the vanity of human wishes, but also that there is a curse associated with the valley, one that is given more direct development in the first full story. The curse in the opening story functions both historically and dramatically, and the resonance of it lingers throughout the volume. All of the events involved what is known as the Battle Farm, founded by George Battle in 1863. He marries an epileptic woman who bears him a son before going insane. The son, John, inherits both proclivities and dies in a religious struggle with a snake. The father, having also expired, the farm lies fallow until The Mustrovics move in, an odd family that mysteriously disappears with breakfast left on the table. These bizarre events pave the way for the introduction of the central family in Pastures, the Monroes. In some ways, the Monroe patriarch Bert is the most important character in the Pastures of Heaven, in that he appears in a variety of stories, always influencing the action by his presence. By settling on the battle farm and taming its reversion to wilderness, Bert makes a success of his labors and enjoys the respect of the community. On the surface, there are a few problems with the family. His wife is dutiful and fecund, producing 3 children in short order. The oldest child, May, is the satisfied recapitulation of her mother. The son, Jimmy, enjoys extraordinary success in romantic conquest. The youngest child, Manfred, is retarded but obedient and submerged with a submerged tendency for hysteria. But of itself, the opening story is one of financial social success for the Monroe family, compromised only by reiterations of the curse on the farm. As is soon evident, with the Monroes comes disaster, tragedy not always caused by them, but somehow precipitated by their presence. Every story that follows contains a Monroe, and the foreboding of the curse provides a motif that pervades all the subsequent action. The story of Shark Wicks exemplifies the richness with which Steinbeck developed the independent stories while simultaneously linking them to the others in the volume. In the broadest terms, this story chronicles the lives of the Wicks family, newcomers in the valley, but more specifically, it is about Edward Wicks, whose nickname Shark results from the pretense that he is a wealthy and sagacious financial investor despite the homely realities of his daily existence. The irony is that his imaginary world of wealth obscures from him where his real treasures reside in a loving and understanding wife and a beautiful, if simple, daughter, Alice. Shark's second obsession is with the virginity of this child, which inspires him to limit her social contacts and restrict her normal development. While he is away on a trip to a family funeral, his wife takes her to a community dance where she meets the wily rake Jimmy Monroe, who later kisses her. When Shark learns of the incident, he seeks revenge with a rifle, is arrested, and when required to post bond, is forced to confess that he is a poor man, his wealth a ruse to enhance his stature. In a sense, the Monroe curse is his undoing, in that the intervention of Jimmy precipitates his fall. On a deeper level, however, the vulnerability is within Shark from the beginning, in his need to establish his stature on a pretense, in his abnormal insecurity about his daughter's chastity. From this perspective, the collapse of Shark Wicks emerges as the result of obsession and illusion, and the Monroe curse is only the occasion for the fall, not the casual agent. This point was emphasized when Steinbeck revisited his manuscript to diminish the role of Jimmy as a predatory seducer and thus transfer the responsibility for the protagonist's humiliation to Shark himself. The fertile promise of Pastures of Heaven, it would seem, is too precarious to admit of illusion, and all who build on pretense are forced to a painful recognition of reality. The story of Larissa, the foundling who is deformed, retarded, and yet gifted with extraordinary physical strength and artistic sensitivity, is perhaps the most remarkable in the collection. This little frog senses some affinity for the gnomes, a mythical race of small beings that dwell within the earth, and his desire to return to his own people and his violence in avenging the destruction of his artistic creations led to his incarceration as criminally insane. What links this story to the entire volume is not Larissa's abnormalities, however, but the application of many of the same themes that inform the surrounding stories. It is again the interaction of the central character with the Monroe family that precipitates the tragic conclusion, when Larissa attacks Bert Monroe and is arrested. This story introduces another important theme, the conflict between the natural instincts and desires of the individual and the demands for conformity to the norms of civilization, an idea best understood by the boy's adoptive father, Franklin Gomez, who argues that his son should not go to school but should be allowed to roam free. He is not crazy, Gomez protests, but is one of those whom God has not quite finished. The societal restriction on individual prerogatives invests several of the stories that follow, and the fact that Larissito's teacher is Molly Morgan links the story directly to the later one concerning her life in the valley. In the end, Larissito has lost his freedom, Gomez has lost his son, and the world has lost the creative potential of one of its extraordinary beings. The motif of mental instability and violence links the story of Larissito to that of Helen van de Venter, a comparatively wealthy woman with a penchant for tragedy in all of its forms. After the death of her husband, Helen gives birth to Hilda, whose pathologies include a violent temper and the creation of imaginative beings of destructive potential. As soon as the widow and her daughter move to the pastures, Bert Monroe comes to pay an innocent courtesy call, which precipitates a series of events that results in Helen's execution of her daughter, a death interpreted as a suicide by the authorities. Oh my goodness. There's bugs out here and they're like flying around, and I'm getting mosquito bites. Oh, and my face is itching from the pollen. Sorry. And this introduction is very long. I've got like 4 more pages. Although a Monroe is again involved tangentially in this tragedy, the story differs from the others in the collection in that the dramatic situation is imported into the valley. Hilda is not driven mad by anything inherent in the valley itself, and Helen's proclivity for tragic situations attendates her move. As the family physician says to her, "You love the hair shirt. Your pain is a pleasure. You won't give up any little shred of tragedy." The events in the life of Junius Maltby also relate to the story of Larissito in the themes of the child undone by compulsory attendance at school and the destruction of the individual by demands for social conformity. Certainly, Junius has his share of tragedy. His father dies in bankruptcy. Junius has a lung condition that forces him out of San Francisco and into the valley of the Pastures of Heaven. His 2 adopted sons die of influenza, and his wife dies in childbirth, leaving him with an infant son, Robbie, named for Robert Louis Stevenson, who came to Monterey in 1879. If these early tragedies can be attributed to the vagaries of fate, the final one cannot. Junius, an undisciplined but thoroughly absorbed scholar of disorganized host of subjects, neglects his farm and domestic responsibilities to give free rein to intellectual interests. Robbie grows to embrace the same free spirit as his father, and they are content and unfettered until the boy is forced to attend school, where he is happy and popular until the inevitable intrusion of yet another Monroe. Mrs. Monroe, appalled at the tattered clothing young Robbie wears to school, presents him with new clothes, highlighting his destitution, and Junius and Robbie leave the valley for San Francisco and a more conventional life. The unwitting gesture of the insensitive Monroes is giving the boy the new clothes, emblems of civilization and conformity, ruins the happiness of the Maltbys. Steinbeck seems to have been particularly intrigued with this story, for he published it independently as Nothing So Monstrous in 1936, 4 years after it was included in the Pastures of Heaven. The most charming and humorous story in the collection features the Lopez sisters, rotund, devout Roman Catholics left to their own devices after the death of their father. Part of the charm results from their attempts at self-deception, at convincing themselves that they run a restaurant and merely encourage their customers, the ones who buy 3 or more enchiladas, with sexual favors. As John H. Timmerman has observed, never would the sisters admit that their sex was for sale, a solely commercial venture relegated in their peculiar theology to fallen women. Once they begin this practice, their business booms, and they make a comfortable place for themselves within the valley. It is again the intrusion of the Monroes into the situation that precipitates their demise and compels their admission that they are in fact prostitutes, and they leave the valley, as did the Maltbys, for San Francisco. They find the strength for this recognition in their simple faith and in their love for each other. The story, originally written as part of a manuscript called The Green Lady and then incorporated into Pastures, provides not only comic relief but another demonstration of the demands of respectable society for conformity. Essentially whores with hearts of gold, out of the tradition begun in the stories of Bret Harte, the Lopez sisters are only the first examples of Steinbeck's use of prostitutes in his fiction, which he was to continue most graphically in his next book, Tortilla Flat, and later in East of Eden. The story of Molly Morgan is the most artistically complex of all the stories, particularly with regard to the handling of time and motivation. In most of the stories, the use of the omniscient narrator simply provides a means of commentary and the establishment of character by exposition rather than dramatic revelation. In this story, however, Steinbeck's skillful juxtaposition of memory with current action allows for the theme of the past living in the present. The great mystery in the background is the whereabouts of Molly's father, an irresponsible parent, an absent husband who nevertheless looms as a romantic hero in his daughter's mind. When Molly arrives in the valley to interview for a teaching position with John Whiteside, who heads the school board, their conversation is interspersed with sections recounting Molly's painful memories of her youth. This device also allows for the dramatic irony of the contrast between the tragic memories and the benign personal histories she relates to Whiteside. She acquires the position and succeeds until the intrusion of Brett Monroe, who describes the profligacy of his new hired hand, and Molly is forced to confront the conflict between the image of her father as a romantic hero and the awful reality that he may well be the drunken sot sleeping in Bert Monroe's car. It is her fear that her father may have returned and her desire to sustain the respectability of society that destroys her happiness. Respectability is not the issue for Raymond Bank, but the confrontation of attitudes. One of the most successful farmers in the valley, Raymond conducts the affairs of his chicken farm in images of purity with white buildings and chickens and ducks. What does not quite fit the picture is his interest in the hangings at San Quentin, where an old friend serves as warden and allows Raymond to observe the executions, an event he approaches with great detachment, scornful of those who have an emotional reaction. It is the intrusion of Bert Monroe, particularly his graphic depiction of a mutilated and dying chicken, that forces Banks to regard the hangings from a new perspective, and he cancels his trip. This is another of the stories in which the resolution consists of a change of perspective, not the outcome of a physical conflict, and it is a rich psychological study most closely linked to the stories of Shark Wicks. The concluding stories of Pat Humbert and John Whiteside both focus on the family house and the valley and the broken dreams associated with it. For Humbert, that house is as stifling as the antiquated attitudes of his parents. When they die, he lives for a time with the ghosts of the past, but an accident allows him to see that new possibilities lie open to him. Inadvertently overhearing a conversation between the comely May Monroe and her mother, in which May expresses an interest in the Humbert house, Pat is inspired to remodel the home as a prelude to beginning their courtship. He finishes the project only to discover that she has just become engaged to young Bill Whiteside. He retreats back to a dark and unutterably dreary house, accepting the sterile solitude that had characterized the lives of his parents, his dreams vanquished. The Monroes are also involved in the destruction of the Whiteside family dreams, although more dramatically so. May Monroe is certainly not the cause of Pat Humbert's distress, in the sense that she is not aware that he has overheard her comments about the house, and she has no idea that he is interested in her romantically. Bert Monroe is more directly involved in the Whiteside debacle. The richest story in the collection, The Saga of the Whiteside Family, covers 3 generations, beginning with Richard's desire to found a dynasty in the Pastures, with the family house as its center. His only child, John, carries on the dream only to have it shattered when his son Bill marries May Monroe, adopts her values, and moves out of the valley. The burning of the family home is thus emblematic of the destruction of the family dream of dynasty. The involvement of the Monroe family is complex in its story. In an earlier tale, Bill Whiteside has an opportunity for a romance with Molly Morgan, who might have who might have remained in the valley and helped fulfill the ancient dream of the valley. But Bill's insensitive comments to her preclude any development of the relationship. Later, Brett Monroe's hired hand frightens her out of the valley altogether. May Monroe might have married Pat Humbert had the timing of the courtship been more favorable, but she weds Bill and insists on moving to Monterey, violating the objectives of the founding father of the Whitesides. But Bill's parents might have remained in the house had Burt Monroe not assisted in a disastrous attempt to burn the brush in the area, which leads to the immolation of the Whiteside house and the family drain. This event, the simultaneous destruction of the family house and stature, links Steinbeck's story to a rich legacy in American fiction, one that includes Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, George Washington Caleb's Belle Damaswell's Plantation, and William Faulkner's Absalom. Oh my God. Why is my nose all itchy? To name only a few. The collapse of the grand ambition of the original settlers of the Pastures of Heaven provides a fitting end to the central stories of the volume, one brought to ironic conclusion by the epilogue. The epilogue provides the enclosing envelope for the 10 stories, much as the prologue initiates the central themes of the volume. That it takes place at a temporal and psychological distance from the central action also mirrors the opening sequence, and the irony of the conclusion completes the stories of broken dreams, disillusionment, and painful realization that awaited the people who moved into the valley. As the opening dramatization, the historic beginnings of the settling of the valley, the closing shows a modern bus bringing tourists to the area along the same route the Spanish corporal had taken. But now the valley has been domesticated with homes and farms, and cows wearing bells have replaced the grazing deer of the prologue. Tourists, too, have their dream for the valley, but they reflect the mercantile ambitions of the new age. Someday there'll be big houses in the valley, stone houses and gardens, golf links and big gates and ironwork. The grand illusions of and dreams of the dynasty of the original settlers have been replaced by the commercial interests of the modern age, and the endemic promise of the verdant nature has drifted back into the past, lost forever in the broken dreams and thwarted ambitions that once belonged to the pastures of heaven. John Steinbeck's reputation as a writer does not rest primarily on Pastures, but it is a major work of American fiction, and it was pivotal in his career. In it, he discovered the central subject of his greatest work, the simple people of the Salinas Valley, struggling against the odds, against economic deprivation and the legacy of the past that threatens to overwhelm them, ideas that inform The Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden. His naturalistic use of characters who are psychologically deformed or obsessed or driven by a curse, he was to use again and again, most brilliantly in Mice of Men and In Dubious Battle. Steinbeck went on to write other collections of interrelated stories containing some of his very best fiction, Tortilla Flat, and especially The Long Valley, which features perhaps his best-known story, The Red Pony. Many of the themes of Pastures, the destructive potential of conformity, the dangers of self-delusion, and false social values, he continued to explore throughout his career, even through The Winter of Our Discontent in 1961. Perhaps it is not too much to claim that the central components of the greatness of Steinbeck's work, his basic style, and subject of fundamental themes, have their origin not in his most celebrated novels, but in an often ignored collection of stories that appeared unceremoniously in 1932, The Pastures of Heaven. Now, some thoughts that I have about this. So, first of all, the timing, 1932. That was the year that my house was completed. Yeah. This property, as it exists today, was completed in 1932. Originally, there was a water tower here on the property as well. But it's interesting thinking about this as being contemporary with this book for me on a personal level. Then also the changing of the name of the family from the Morans to the Monroes. There is a Moran family from the area here. and they've been here for quite some time. And so I'm wondering if he made that decision so as not to have any untoward likeness or comparison between actual persons, right? Because he was writing fiction. Um, and the interconnectedness of the stories, as a uh, motif that is popular in American fiction, that continues has continued on. You see that in Salinger's work. You see that in Carver's work. You see that in oh, who's the other one? Raymond Carver, and who's the other guy? Who wrote Falconer? Cheever, John Cheever. In Carver and Cheever's work. You see it in Vonnegut's work, right? And it's interesting that all of this was precipitated by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, right? Little House on the Prairie, right? About the families, and how her work, the way it was much longer. So like he wrote this volume inspired by the multiple volumes that became the Little House series, the written novels, and then ultimately the TV series, which is now evidently being redone by Netflix, I heard. I will not be watching it because I do not consume Netflix for many reasons, a variety of reasons. And there's no reason to redo Little House. Jeez, oh Pete's, why redo it? But what is interesting, like, why not? They're redoing Little House, but why not do some Steinbeck, right? Like, I have long thought. There's a one of his novels, Burning Bright, is written as a stage play, and it's very, very interesting, where it's like the same story, but halfway through the story, the characters switch from like one situation to another. Like I think there's one where like it starts off where it's this couple who are carnies, and like halfway through it's the same story, like all the same stuff is still happening, but the people's identities have changed. They're now different people with different names in um, with different occupations, right? The Moon is Down. The Moon is Down would be an excellent adaptation. Yeah, most certainly. Most certainly. Oh my God, my face is itching. So, this idea of interconnected. And I used it myself. I used that device, that literary device myself when I wrote my vignettes of men, portraits of men. The woman, the unnamed woman that is in every single one. That she's the same woman, right? Just like placed in different situations in different places in order to meet these different men. Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting device. Huh, this book will be interesting to read. Keeping all of those things in mind, and being so close to Salinas and having just been down there recently, and um, some of the photos that are included in the photo essays in my work, Common Ground, are from the Salinas Valley, right? That's, Elkhorn Slough and all of that down there in Moss Landing. Saw Salinas Valley there. Yeah. No, I love John Steinbeck. I love Steinbeck. I do. I've read In Dubious Metal and Mice and Men, Tortilla Flat. I read the Red Pony, because you can get that. It's just published by itself, a real short little like chapbook. To a God Unknown. I have not read Grapes of Wrath in its entirety. I have not. Maybe I should. I don't know. But what I think I need to really do is go inside, because pollen and stuff out here, and the bugs are making me crazy. So I guess tomorrow I'll do the next two chapters. The first chapter is really short. It's really short. So it's like a prologue. That's what they were saying, what the introduction was saying. Who wrote the introduction? James Nagel. With introductions and notes by James Nagel. Some professor at the University of Georgia, it said. Founding professor, whatever. It's interesting that the introduction is written by somebody from the American South as opposed to the West Coast. It speaks to the proclivity of the South to claim all rights to agricultural culture in the United States. And you see that in, like, when it comes to, like, country music, right? There's like a big disdain for country music that or country style music that has come out of California. Um, anyway, it's the difference between left wing and right wing politics, right? Yeah. Anyway, time to go flip the laundry.